Hello, this is Ashley Craig, and tonight I'll be presenting a brief review of the boundary conditions for on screen text when there is narration, which is the redundancy principle. As discussed by Clark and Mayer in 2016, the redundancy principle establishes that compounding visual text with a graphic that already has a narrated explanation does not improve learning outcomes and can oftentimes do more harm than good. Much of the evidence presented in their writing dealt with technical topics and or hands-on tasks, hands-on in the sense that a person's hands are on the computer. Anyway, in the graph pictured, evidence clearly shows that in multimedia lessons for soldering, participants who learned from animation with narration scored significantly higher on transfer tests than participants who learned from animation with narration and redundant text. In reading this research, I understand why this greater focus on technical learning is the case, but it does leave me pondering how to apply the principle to my particular content area of reading and language arts, or RLA. My world is text, so the redundancy principle, while perfectly logical, presents an issue for me. What is a critical consideration for when a graphic is sufficient versus when text is critical is often the case when reading and writing instruction. Which brings us to Clark and Mayer's boundary conditions for defining exceptions to the redundancy principle. This includes occasions in which there are not visual components, the content is student-paced, the content introduces critical vocabulary, written components are actually shorter than the narration. In my field of instruction, all four of these exceptions apply, and often all in the same lesson. For one thing, there are not visual components a lot of times. The hurdle here is that the visual itself is, in many cases, text. Think about sample sentences for grammar instruction, excerpts for examination in close reading, and just a whole slew of other examples. There are instances in which shortening or removing the text would actually remove all of the educational value. A comma floating in space is just a fleck, and an author's use of figurative language has no meaning without context. Uh, and the student needs to be in control of the pace. One of the challenges faced by RLA teachers is that students all read at different speeds, and they need to be allotted time for reading and processing information on their own. Giving them opportunities for self-paced instruction is ideal because it enables the students to take the time they need to integrate the information they are receiving with their existing knowledge, and they can return to the topic again if need be. The content also introduces critical vocabulary. This is an integral piece of teaching reading, exposing the students to new vocabulary, and it doesn't really require much more explanation other than that we have to show learners words to teach them words. And then probably the hardest thing about the redundancy principle is that it's not always easy to shorten the text, because they talk about that if the text is shorter than the narration, this is an element that is heavy laden with the when possible caveat. Given the nature of RLA instruction and how we analyze the nuanced uses of the English language to accomplish a purpose, there are countless examples of needing to display the complete sentence or paragraph upon which discussion is focused. This is also a contributing factor in the importance of enabling learners to move at their own pace, again, when possible. When taking the redundancy principle into consideration, I have to approach it with a grain of salt, which is, in fact, exactly what Clark and Mayer say. It cannot be applied in the same way for every instance. However, even with text heavy activities, the principles can still apply to instructional materials to maximize learning during the mini lessons before diving deeper into application with an actual text. With this in mind, the optimal considerations, even for RLA instructions, still apply the redundancy principle largely the same, just with an emphasis on the when possible caveat. Uh, Minimize text and instructional materials when possible, supplement instruction with visuals rather than text when possible, enable students to move backward and forward through the content at their pace, and be brief in text with instructional materials, and apply the redundancy principle at the teacher's discretion when delving into um, lengthier texts. This is Ashley Craig, and thank you for listening. Go Tigers.